Hello and welcome to the video on interpreting Frankenstein and Mary Shelley's classic masterpiece about a scientist who reanimates the dead. Now, just going through what is the main ideas of the story, and just to give you a bit of a background to what we're going to be looking at in this lesson to start with, is what we're going to be looking at is not only the text itself, but basically some starting points for you for when you do your own interpretation of it, and particularly when you start to develop your own ideas for it. Now, what we've got here is basically, as I said, starting points. They're starting blocks where you can look for some ideas, some textual parts of the text to look for. So what they're there for you to do is to then look at them, explore them, and develop them in such a way that you can develop your own ideas and your own responses based on your own sort of analysis. So that's basically what we're going to be looking at. Now, it's a difficult text to interpret because of the fact that it uses a lot of quite heavy description, and particularly this use of sublime metaphor. Now, what sublime metaphor is basically this connection between man and nature, and basically in a way that's supposed to indicate how beautiful both are. So a lot of the descriptions that you'll see in the story are, yes, of the countryside, and particularly the settings, and it is a very beautiful European setting in this story. But they are also used in such a way where they can easily be interpreted as a metaphor for beauty, purity, isolation, all the rest. So there are lots of things there to look for. But we'll go through a number of different ideas as we go. In this lesson, we'll also explore some other sorts of pertinent ideas where you can begin your analysis. So we're going to look at some themes, we're going to look at some ideas, we're going to look at some general things which are important to this text. And we're also going to look at basically how you can start your interpretation. So naturally, you'll be required to develop your own analysis, because by having these ideas, you need to be able to discuss them. This is the most important part of it. So by taking these ideas on board and then using this as a way to start developing your own, you have a lot more that you can start writing about, and obviously your responses are going to have a lot more depth than if you're just basically regurgitating answers that have been given here. So part of this will be giving you some ideas that will help you, and part of this will be giving you some indication about where to go next. All right, so to start with, let's look at the emotional side of this text. And it is a very emotional sort of text because it is a romanticist text. It's one which is basically placing emphasis on the emotional and the sublime. It is creating this very romantic view of nature and society, which is almost in some cases idealized, and definitely placed in a sense that we really are thrown up this question about what makes someone human, what makes life beautiful, and what sort of characteristics do we judge that upon. So that is, it links basically the human spirit to the beauty of the natural world. In this case, particularly with William and Elizabeth, but also to an extent some of the other characters, we start to see their links in with the beauty of the natural world, and often the harshness of the natural world as well when we're looking at the creature. However, even the creature makes notes about life being beautiful around him, and he wants to be a part of that beauty, but because of the fact that he is quite hideous, he doesn't quite seem like he fits in that way. So that's an idea that you can further explore. And Shelley's long sweeping descriptions of the natural world blend with this Gothic narrative, this very dark, horrific thing. So we do get those dark elements, and they get incorporated into this romanticist style. And they're ones that basically they interweave, they go back and forth a little bit. So you start to see the clash of these two styles. Now, a lot of the ones that are written after this are quite descriptive, but don't probably have the same sort of romantic qualities that Shelley's version does. It's still somewhat stuck in this romanticist time frame, which actually makes it quite an interesting story to read. It makes it a little bit long-winded, but the main thing is that it helps to create this link between and this question of what is natural, and particularly this idea that Frankenstein's experiment is not natural and is an abomination, and really something that maybe whatever idea you get out of that whether it's that nature can't be made or made by man's hand or whatever it may be, you've got some ideas there which you can then develop and talk about. It basically helps to convey a sense of loss for both man and beast as well. And basically what that means is by connecting humanity and the natural world, we can sort of see this idea of what both of them lose. And we see that in Victor, and we see that in the beast. In the case of the beast, we probably see that almost in what he never has, in that he never has a basically way to belong. He never has a way to fit in with the beauty of the natural world around him. Whereas in terms of Victor, we probably see him in a sense that the world is always tainted by the fact that he's created such an abomination in it. And he doesn't look at the world the same way. He looks at it as a very hostile sort of place. And even though there are these very beautiful descriptions which are used by both of them, we tend to feel that they are sort of punctuated a little bit by the fact that both of them seem like they're quite lost in their lives. Victor in the deaths of the people he loves, and in the creatures, the fact that no one will accept him at all. So here's a quote that will just basically match that style. So, they congregated around me, the unstained snowy mountaintop, the glittering pinnacle, the pine woods, the ragged bare ravine, the eagle soaring amidst the clouds. They all gathered around me and bade me at peace. So, is that description that not only describes the beauty of the natural world, but starts to connect the world with him as well. And this is a description of Mont Blanc, which is basically a part of the story where he's sort of a bit lost, and certainly after this creature comes into his life, he starts to feel a little bit tormented, and certainly these sorts of descriptions match the worldview of someone who is feeling quite tormented. So what that means is what you've basically got to decide, whether that is to connect his vulnerability, whatever it is. So you need to find some sort of word, some sort of description that goes with basically what this is representing. And that's the idea of basically interpreting this sort of fiction, particularly with romanticist style, is that it often leaves a lot for interpretation through the fact that it does make this very strong assumption that people can see the beauty in nature. And that's one of the things that particularly this sort of passage represents. And there are a number of passages like this in the story. This one's taken from volume 2, chapter 2. So if you're looking for it, it's roughly about page 113 and 114. So have a look at that section, because there are lots of very good descriptions in there, and there are lots of other sections as well. All right, horror. Now, as a Gothic text, so this is the text sort of two-headed nature in a sense. Frankenstein conveys a sense of uneasiness in the macabre, basically this horrific sort of almost base human sort of way of looking at the world, which is the basic elements of humanity, this sort of evil that's not only created in the beast, but also through Victor as well. And even though Victor is somewhat of he's in fact quite a good man, he's sort of evil in the sense that he is given a very crooked ambition. And his ambition is basically drives him to such an extent where he doesn't think about things. He just goes ahead and does them. And it is this sort of thing that is his downfall, particularly in the story, is that he doesn't really think ahead. And particularly when he rushes ahead to create this creature in his excitement, one of the things that happens is that he doesn't really realize, oh, well, there's going to be consequences if the creature comes to life and it's hideous. And he doesn't consider that. He considers that, oh, this will only turn out well, which I think we pretty much know as an audience that never happens. So it's one of those things that he's just very impulsive, and particularly in the case of the creature's sense of loneliness and his sense of, and his desire for revenge particularly, are things which are given very, very strong, horrific description, and certainly help to set up this sense of violence and fear. And often he's a very terrifying presence. And this, basically, he's a very powerful creature. He's almost a ghost in the background in a lot of scenes. And even now, that sort of matches a lot of the things that we see in very good horror stories, is not so much sense of direct action, but this feeling that this creature is always around. And even though he's articulate and quite intelligent and doesn't really show, particularly at the beginning, any real reason to be fearful of him, and in fact we're quite sympathetic for him, he still has that terrifying presence. And is basically coupled with these emotive descriptions, so that of the cold, of the darkness around them, basically the violence between the two of them. There's this very cold atmosphere that gets developed, particularly in very strong parts of the text, and particularly very climactic sections are given this sense of coldness and this sort of very uneasy atmosphere that continues on throughout the story. So, for example, and this is at one of the key scenes, particularly this one is at Elizabeth's death. And I saw the open window, a figure the most hideous and abhorred. A grin was on the face of the monster, as with his fiendish finger he pointed towards the corpse of my wife. Now this description goes on a little bit, I couldn't get the whole thing in, but it's one of those really powerful ones. It sort of sets up this really sort of, I wouldn't say heart-stopping moments, but it's one of those moments in the story where you really start to feel quite uneasy about this monster, but also you sort of also feel a little bit for Victor in the sense that he's so willing to sacrifice his own life, and yet this beast has taken his wife instead. And there's this sense of hostility between the two of them, which is basically conveyed through this language. And he doesn't have to get into a fight with him to have that sort of sense of horror prevail. But basically the sense that he's always around, he's always tormenting Victor and the people he loves. And that's one of those things that comes through the language, and also through the way that his mentality is described, through the way that Victor is described to a certain extent. And is one of those things that sort of contrasts very strongly with the beauty of nature compared to the horror of what this creature is and what Frankenstein has created. So science and nature is another key idea in the story, and particularly when you're focusing on this, you're going to be probably focusing a lot on this idea of this debate about whether people should be contributing to changing nature, to use science to make it better, so to speak. And basically there's this constant debate now, I guess, between the benefits of science versus the benefits of nature and the natural world. So, and this is one that's also explored in this text, and you can see that through basically not only those two descriptions, but also the way that it's written, and the way that the Romanticist and Gothic styles of the story clash together. We almost see this blending of an enlightened style, which is sort of coming from this age of reason, this age of science, moving away from the church, compared to this Romanticism and Gothic stories, which are sort of almost done in opposition to that, which is that society was too structured and maybe too dependent on science for growth. So these two things sort of clash together. So through the movements in the style of Enlightenment and Romanticism, there's a constant juxtaposition that goes on between faith and science. And there is, while it doesn't openly go through and talk about God, it does raise a couple of issues that particularly come through different readings. The title itself was inspired by a passage from Paradise Lost. The title, The Modern Prometheus, is inspired by the Greek Titan. And so there are lots of references not only to history but also to religion as well. So there is this conflict between these references to religion, and certainly this was a world still inspired a lot by religion, and where a lot of the prevailing ideas that continued on through most people's lives were inspired by religious values, compared to this new adventurous, brave new world of science and all the things that science was bringing into the world. So there's basically this conflict between the two of them. And science does conflict in this case with morality as well. And the moral questions that we get, such as Frankenstein destroying the female creation, have a dramatic impact. We can understand the reasons why. But at the same time, we can sort of look at the idea of, okay, he was wrong. wrong perhaps to create this creature in the first place, wrong to tamper with nature. But at the same time, he's also sort of wrong to deny this creature happiness. So there's this constant contrast, and it's one where it can be open to debate, where neither side really has a clear ground, where you can debate, where you can basically throw up a lot of questions about these sorts of ideas. So we've got essentially these two things conflicting with each other. And this scene in particular is one that particularly highlights that gulf between this idea of science and nature, but there are a lot of other examples in there as well. So look for that idea of where does science and nature meet? How do we sort of see that they are hostile to each other? In what situation do we sort of feel that either the work of Victor Frankenstein or others around him is sort of going against what we value? Whether they are doing things that are moral, whether they are doing things which are right and just, and whether there is justice in the story, which is the other thing. So those are the sorts of questions that come out of the debate of science versus nature. So this is a quote which basically sort of follows that line, which is, "The wretch saw me destroy the creature of whose future existence he depended on for happiness, and with a howl of devilish despair and revenge withdrew." So we suddenly see this contrast between this almost science experiment with this very human emotion that he's feeling, this howling and of devilish sort of despair, this sort of real feeling of emptiness and loss that he gets as soon as his potential companion is destroyed. All right, let's look at identity, because this is another one, which is basically the identity of the creature and the creature's search for a belonging. Is a potent driving force within the story. It's the story of a creature trying to fit in with a world that doesn't really want him. So it is one of a crucial theme in the story, and particularly the way that he tries to find some sort of acceptance. And he eventually has to turn to Victor to create basically another person for him out of desperation for companionship. So even though he's quite articulate and in many cases quite noble, he's not a bad man by any means. For a ghoul, he's not a bad dude. But really, what we get out of that is we get this conflict again of basically, who am I? What am I doing? Why won't anyone talk to me? And this is the sort of thing that he has to constantly deal with. And the fact that his creator, is almost his father, runs away from him from the moment that he is awakened from his basically when Frankenstein wakes him up. There's a sort of sense that he's constantly outcast, and there's a sense that he wants to find somewhere where he can belong. Particularly this quest for acceptance, one that has tragic consequences for both him and for others as well. So it does have consequences for him in that he has to constantly move around, he constantly has to hide around, but also for Victor and the other people who are in his life face the consequences because of the fact that this beast is quite angry, and justifiably so, I guess, that he cannot find somewhere that he can basically belong, and he can't find anywhere where he's able to fit in together. All right, so it's an idea to look at. The creature's quest for revenge is another very strong point, and this is one of the real dominant ones. It has a very powerful dramatic impact because of the fact that we really depict him as both sympathetic, and we're sympathetic to him, but also that he's very violent and very vicious, that he's very calculated, and he's not only very strong, but he's also very smart. So the combination of strength and smarts, that intelligence, makes him someone who is, as a beast, is quite threatening. And particularly this is the sort of terror that Frankenstein has to go through as he's watching this creature basically take out the people in his life. So, and we sort of get this villain, in a sense, where we do feel sympathetic for him because we feel the fact that he's quite smart, he tries to be good, he tries to do the best he can for humanity, but humanity still want anything to do with him just based on his appearance, just based on the fact that he's very ghastly. So we don't really get the sense of him being ever really cared for, and this basically leads to his quest for revenge. And it positions the reader, because it starts to almost put you on one side of the fence or the other. It starts to make you either feel sympathetic for Frankenstein because of the fact that all the people have been taken from his life, or you start to position yourself towards the creature because of the fact that basically the creature is alone, he's lost, he's looking for attention, he's just looking to be loved by someone, he's not even loved by the man who created him. And that would be a fairly hollow feeling, and certainly we feel sympathy for that as well. So based on those two sorts of sides of the fence, you can sort of then debate the effect that revenge has in telling the story, and particularly the idea that revenge is not only a driving force, but it also does throw up different sorts of questions about whether the creature was right to take revenge on Victor, and whether or not that such actions were justified. There are lots of questions there, and particularly as you progress through the text and as you go through and read it, and as you pick through the key scenes in the story, we sort of get the sense that this creature is doing whatever he can to basically not only get attention, but also to get just some base things that people want, the desire to be loved, the desire to have a sense of home and belonging as well. All right, tragedy is also one of the very key themes of the story, and it follows the basic principle of a tragedy story, and particularly those of Shakespeare before this was written, among others, but also Greek tragedies as well. And the bleak setting of the North Pole reflects this. So, for example, that's one of the examples of a tragic setting, where it's basically man and beast, united and divided by grief, are driven to madness in their deaths. So there's a sense where it's one of those stories, yes, where a lot of people do to perish, but it's one of those things as well that it's basically all of the deaths in here are tragic. We feel sympathetic for every person who gets involved in this, including both Victor and the creature as he casts himself away. So this element of tragedy comes in that you sort of have to ask, again, moral questions. And certainly it raises a lot of challenges when you are not only looking at perspectives, but you're also looking at the effects of science, of the consequences of this beast creation, and also basically the ideas that permeate throughout the entire story, that of this fear, this sense of being hunted, all of these things sort of lead to this very tragic end where no one really seems to get a satisfying conclusion to it. Everything ends tragically. The death of Victor's family and friends, and basically this moral question, essentially everything that surrounds this creature in his quest for revenge, including the climax of the story where the creature holds Victor in his arms, are all tragic in nature and therefore reflect this idea of tragedy, and particularly in a way that a Hamlet or a Macbeth would do exactly the same thing. So when you look at all of these ideas, what you need to do is you need to start looking around in the text. There are a couple of quotes there to start you off with, but there are other sections of the text which also very heavily go on the themes. And depending on what you get asked in relation to this text, there are lots of ideas which do come out of it regarding not only science and nature, but also really not only the way it's written, but basically the whole sense that this story is one of those classics that asks a lot of very moral and very difficult questions, which at the time particularly, I guess the society probably wasn't really ready for. This was a text well and truly ahead of its time. We didn't really see more stories like this until at least the 20th century. And so we sort of really feel that for not only these two characters, but we also sort of get this sense of tragedy that comes out of it, this very bleak, very almost depressing sort of story that continues throughout, and basically this sort of hopelessness that carries on throughout. So what you need to do now is you need to go through the text, go through the key sections of the text, pick out some very important ideas or important quotes from the text that you can use, and start to think about, okay, what sort of reactions do I get to particularly the strong moments in the story? What sorts of things do you think that they're hinting towards? Do some research, do some background on what it is that is happening in society at this time, and maybe the reasons for these sorts of elements coming into the story. Think about the sort of the depth of the two main characters, and along with the other characters as well. Clerval, who we haven't really spoken about much here, is one of those characters as well, who's sort of this unquestioning friend, and despite the fact that he knows that something's wrong, he doesn't really press him about it. So there's lots of different things in there where you can not only ask questions, but then develop them and shape them into responses as well. So that's basically it for interpreting it. As I said before, go back, have a look at the text, have another read of it for yourself, and basically just have a small think about it, and just think about all the really small and big ideas, particularly the big ideas that are in there, which will make you sort of feel that you've got something that you can put into a response, which helps to not only satisfy the criteria that you're being asked on, but also really sort of give you an idea of the sorts of ideas and themes that you can basically interpret from it. Now, these are all up to you. Everything that's been mentioned here are just ideas. They're not necessarily things that are set in stone, and certainly they are things that you can easily disregard as well as use, provided, of course, that you can discuss them, explain them, and then be able to develop them. But that's basically it. So until next time, I'll see you later.